The winter of 1603 settled over Richmond Palace like a heavy woolen blanket. Queen Elizabeth Tudor, the Virgin Queen who had ruled England for 45 years, stood before her ornate silver mirror in the flickering candlelight. At 69, she had outlived most of her contemporaries, watched empires rise and fall, and guided her nation through wars, plagues, and prosperity. But tonight, something was different about her reflection. Dr. Margaret Thompson, a modern historian specializing in Tudor England, had spent years studying the final months of Elizabeth's reign. She sat in her study at Cambridge University, surrounded by ancient documents and leather-bound books. The portrait before her showed the Queen in all her glory, the elaborate golden crown, the intricate ruff collar, the jeweled gowns that spoke of power and majesty. Yet there was something haunting about this particular image, something that had captured her attention for months. Margaret had always been drawn to the human stories behind historical figures. While others focused on political achievements and military victories, she wondered about the quiet moments. What did Elizabeth think about when she was alone? How did it feel to carry the weight of a kingdom for nearly half a century? The documents spread across Margaret's desk told a story that few historians had dared to explore fully. Letters from Elizabeth's ladies-in-waiting, physicians' notes, and court records painted a picture of a woman grappling with mortality in her final winter. The official histories spoke of a queen who remained sharp and commanding until the very end. But the private accounts revealed something far more human. Lady Catherine Whitmore, one of Elizabeth's closest companions, had written in her private diary about the Queen's strange behavior in those last months. Elizabeth had become obsessed with mirrors, spending hours staring at her reflection. She would speak to the glass as if addressing another person, sometimes in whispers so soft that even Catherine, standing nearby, could not make out the words. The court physicians, led by Dr. John Whitaker, had documented these episodes with growing concern. They noted that the Queen seemed to be having conversations with someone unseen, gesturing and nodding as if receiving replies. When questioned about it, Elizabeth would simply smile and say she was consulting with her truest advisor. Margaret leaned back in her chair, studying the portrait once more. The image showed Elizabeth in two halves, one side the magnificent Queen in all her earthly glory, the other revealing the skull beneath the skin. It was a powerful representation of Memento Mori, the artistic tradition of reminding viewers of their mortality. But Margaret began to wonder if this wasn't just artistic symbolism. What if it represented something Elizabeth had actually experienced? She turned to another document, this one written by Father Michael O'Brien, an Irish priest who had somehow gained access to the Queen's final weeks, despite the religious tensions of the time. His account was different from all the others. He wrote of Elizabeth speaking about a companion who had been with her throughout her reign, a presence that helped her make the difficult decisions that shaped history. According to Father O'Brien's notes, Elizabeth had told him that for years she had seen two reflections in every mirror. One showed her as the world saw her, crowned, powerful, magnificent. The other showed her as she truly was beneath it all, mortal, vulnerable, human. She called this second reflection her truest self, the part of her that remembered what it meant to be simply Elizabeth, not the Queen of England. Margaret stood up from her desk and walked to the window overlooking the university grounds. Students hurried across the courtyard, bundled against the cold. She thought about the burden Elizabeth had carried, ascending to the throne at 25, and never truly having a moment to be anything other than a queen. The pressure must have been overwhelming. Returning to the documents, Margaret found Elizabeth's own words, recorded by her secretary in the final weeks. The Queen had spoken about how the second reflection had been her companion through every major decision of her reign. When she chose to remain unmarried, when she ordered the execution of Mary Queen of Scots, when she faced the Spanish Armada, always this other self had been there, reminding her of the human cost of royal choices. "She keeps me honest," Elizabeth had reportedly said. "While the world sees only the crown, she sees the woman who wears it. She reminds me that beneath all this gold and ceremony I am dust, just as my subjects are dust. And perhaps that makes me a better queen, knowing that I am no different from those I serve." The accounts from Elizabeth's final days painted a picture of acceptance rather than fear. As her health declined through the winter of 1603, she spent even more time with her mirrors. But according to the witnesses, she no longer seemed to be having conversations. Instead, she would stand quietly, observing both reflections, the queen and the mortal woman, with what Lady Catherine described as a peaceful understanding. Dr. Whitaker's final medical notes recorded that in her last conscious moments, Elizabeth had asked to be helped to her mirror one final time. She had looked at her reflection for several long minutes, then smiled and said, "We have served well together, haven't we?" When asked to whom she was speaking, she had simply replied, "To my truest counselor. She's ready to rest now, as am I." Margaret closed the document and looked again at the haunting portrait. She began to understand that perhaps this wasn't just about Elizabeth's final days, but about the entire arc of her reign. For 45 years, the Queen had lived with the constant awareness of her own mortality, while projecting immortal strength to her kingdom. The second reflection hadn't been a sign of failing health or madness. It had been wisdom. In a world where monarchs were expected to be divine, untouchable, and eternal, Elizabeth had found a way to remain human. By acknowledging death while living fully, by seeing both the crown and the skull, she had perhaps found the secret to being both a great queen and a complete person. As Margaret prepared to write her paper on these findings, she realized that Elizabeth's story wasn't really about her final days at all. It was about how she had lived with full awareness of what she was, what she represented, and what she would one day leave behind. The mirror had shown her both the temporary glory of earthly power and the eternal truth of human mortality. Elizabeth Tudor died on March 24, 1603, having ruled for 45 years. Her death marked the end of the Tudor dynasty and the beginning of a new era. But in her final moments, according to those who were there, she died not as a queen, but as a woman who had lived fully in the knowledge of both her power and her humanity. Margaret smiled as she began typing her conclusion. Sometimes the most profound truths about historical figures weren't found in the grand gestures or public proclamations, but in the quiet moments when they faced themselves honestly. Elizabeth's final days hadn't revealed a failing monarch, but rather a woman who had found peace in accepting both sides of her nature, the eternal queen and the mortal human being who had worn the crown with remarkable grace. In the end, that dual vision had perhaps been Elizabeth's greatest strength. By never forgetting her mortality, she had found a way to live and rule that transcended the temporary nature of earthly power. The mirror had been her truest advisor, indeed reflecting not just what she appeared to be, but everything she truly was.